Hello, welcome everyone. Today's talk will be called Go Beyond the Spec with Custom Directives. So what does this mean? I always like to say people are looking for ways to bend the rules. At least when I was a kid, I always were looking for ways to bend the rules. So today I'll be showing how you can bend the rules of the spec a bit, or at least try and go beyond it to do more than what the spec offers to you. Of course, there's only so much that the GraphQL specification can describe, because there's a multi-million amount of use cases people have, people trying to mutate things, trying to find their own ways to build the best possible GraphQL solution, and the spec can only describe so much. So let's see how you can actually bend the rules a bit. And if you will look at the specification, and I think this was the latest edition, besides the working draft, it actually states that GraphQL services and tooling may provide additional custom directives than the ones described in the specification. And it's also a preferred way to extend GraphQL with custom or experimental behavior. And this is especially nice as you probably don't want to break the spec, because a good thing of GraphQL is that you have a specification that sort of becomes a guideline for you to know which rules there are and which rules you shouldn't break in order to have a valid GraphQL implementation. At least one of the major reasons for me to switch from REST as my preferred way of building APIs to GraphQL was that there is an actual specification for GraphQL, whereas REST is often more free wheels. So we'll be using custom directives to extend GraphQL APIs in a way that you maybe haven't thought about before. So I'm also happy to be back at a GraphQL Conf. I'm not sure if there are any people from Europe here. I am at least from Europe. But we used to have a conference called GraphQL Conf. It went remote after during the pandemic. But a lot of people that I met today were also at this conference in 2019. And I was speaking there around, building GraphQL with ReasonML, which is some sort of, it's a bit like OCaml, so it's a strictly typed language, mostly used in front ends, and I was explaining there how you can use it to build type-safe web applications with GraphQL as well. But it's great to be back at a GraphQL conference that's supporting the community. A little bit about me. My name is Roy. I'm a lifelong software developer. I used to work at a company called StepZen, where we created a product to help you build GraphQL APIs. So we recently joined IBM, so I'm now also a part of this little company. You might have read some of my books or watched my previous talks, so I always help to learn developers new cool things, and going to conferences and writing books is one way to help people get forward. So before diving into custom directives, I wanted to explain a bit what actual directives are, because some of you might not be familiar with all the description there is in the specification. So directives are a way to describe alternative runtime execution and validate behavior in a GraphQL document. So this is also from the spec. I guess a lot of us actually use directives without knowing what directives actually are, or how you should implement them, or what sort of constraints there might be to directives. So there are built-in directives, and you probably use some of them. One of them is skip. You have another one that's called include. They're both basically doing the same thing, but the other way around. So you can use skip if you want to skip certain fields based on a variable, and for include you can do the same. There's also deprecated, which I believe is a bit, we might be able to use it more. Especially useful if you have fields in your GraphQL schema that you no longer want to use in the future. So if you're building a GraphQL API that's used by external people, or maybe a public GraphQL API, you probably have used deprecated to indicate some fields might be deleted in the future. And there's also specified by, which is quite new. It isn't used that much, but it is used to describe where certain scalars come from. So if you add any scalars to your GraphQL schema, you should be using specified by to let people know where they can find more information on the scalar that you added to your schema. You can also create your own, and if you create your own, we call this custom directives. So they're not built in. There are custom directives that you created, or maybe the tooling you're using to build GraphQL APIs has created for you. So more around custom directives later. Let's go into directives a bit deeper. So directives offer you a way to alternate runtime execution, and this will also depend on location. If you look at directives, they can basically be placed in two different locations. You have either type system directives, so these are directives that you add to your GraphQL schema, and there's also executable directives, and these are directives that you use whenever you send a request to a GraphQL API. So if you'll be using graphical or sending a request over HTTP or some other transport protocol, you can use executable directives in there to change the response. So type system directives are, in my opinion, the most powerful ones, because they can be used by GraphQL tooling and library to help you build GraphQL APIs or improve the way you offer your GraphQL API to people consuming it. They will look a bit like this. For example, the @deprecated built-in directive is a type system directive. You will place it in your GraphQL schema, and in there you can add it to fields, but also probably to more locations within the schema, but more around that later. And if you would use something like this, like the @deprecated, whenever some tooling like graphical or some graphical implementation, because it's one of the nicest things of the newer graphicals, you can actually change the look and feel and use it inside your own applications, as we did at StepZen as well. But this deprecated directive, it isn't seen whenever you send a request, so it's a type system directive. But you can see its result. So you can see actually that this field name is being deprecated, and the author of this GraphQL API wants you to use the first name and last name fields instead. So this is very powerful if you build APIs that are consumed by other parties. And these directives, these type system directives, they can be added to objects, fields, inputs, and more. In this solution, I've added it to a field. And there are multiple locations you can use. So within the type system, you have different locations that you can use, and you can add directives to these locations. The one I used here was field definition, but there are many more that you can add them to. So this is also really powerful when you define your own custom directives. You also have a say in which locations they can be applied to. And you want to do this because otherwise you might run into issues later on, because maybe someone is trying to do something that you haven't added to your implementation of this directive. So all directives within a GraphQL schema need to have a unique name. So there's no way to have two deprecated custom directives. So the built-in directives, for example, should be reserved keywords. And if you add your own custom directives, they should also be reserved keywords, because otherwise you might run into issues when you have multiple directives with the same name. And also the order matters. Maybe I should have had an example for this, but the order in which you add your directives to the schema actually matters. And this means that you can sort of chain them up to sort of mutate how something needs to be done. So maybe you have an uppercase directive or at lowercase directive, or you have a directive to change naming from camel case to kebab case, or the other way around. You can actually change these directives in order to transform its result. And then the other location for directives is executable. So this is whenever you're sending a request to an API, GraphQL API. There's multiple locations you can use here. The ones you see most is either add them at the operation level, like a query, mutation, or subscription, or add them to a specific field. You can also add them to fragment definitions and fragment spreads, inline fragments. If you watch the previous talk around defer and stream, these would also be directives, so you can see how can they be applied to multiple levels, or sometimes the creator of the directive actually determines that you can only add them to one or two locations. So they can be added to operations, fields, and more, as we just saw. For example, the built-in directive add include. It's only added. You can only use it when you're sending a request to the API. And for example, here you can decide to include or exclude a result from the response. So we have all these locations that I just showed. They should also be unique per location, so there's no way to add multiple add includes on one line. So if you have multiple, if there's multiple reasons why you might want to show first name or last name, you can only use one. So you need to be aware of this whenever you implement these executable location directives. And the cool thing is they can be repeated. So you can have multiple add includes or multiple whatever type of directive you might be using in here. Of course, when the directive is applied to like the operation level, you can only have one unless you're sending multiple operations in your document. So let's go back to creating your own directives. So as the GraphQL specification notes, directives are a way to extend GraphQL with custom or experimental behavior. So in the current stream might be more experimental because it isn't implemented yet by a lot of different GraphQL solutions. But as soon as it is, it's a good way to, well, it's no longer extend GraphQL, maybe. But whenever you have something experimental like this and it isn't included in the definitive specification, you can also use the directives to try it out. And you actually see that a lot of GraphQL tools and libraries are using directives to extend the GraphQL specification with whatever type of things they like to add. There used to be a library called GraphQL Lodash, which is pretty cool actually. It gave you all sorts of custom directives to do things you can also do in Lodash, like filtering or sorting data, or basically transforming how the data is returned. So I'd like to say a schema with custom directives is a bit like the left one. It might be GraphQL on steroids, giving you all sorts of superpowers that you can use in your schema, whereas the built-in custom directives, or actually they're no longer custom, the built-in directives are kind of basic. They might be usable for use cases, but quite often you want to do more than this. And you also don't want to break the specification or write a lot of code in your resolvers or context when you build your own GraphQL API. So why custom directives? Of course, to extend GraphQL schemas with additional things, but also something I really like around GraphQL, it's a very declarative language for your APIs. With REST, you're sort of working with all these different endpoints, these different data structures. The thing I like about GraphQL is declarative. I always like to say it's like SQL for your APIs, like SQL is used for well, relational databases. So GraphQL is declarative, and directives really help you to keep GraphQL declarative. Of course, you can implement it in your resolvers and context, like I said, but these directives will really help you to keep GraphQL declarative, like, in my opinion, it's supposed to be. So let's say you're defining a directive, a custom directive in this sense. You would add it to a schema definition. So you would say, I have a directive, let's call it at rest. It's something we use at StepZen to let you take data from a REST API and make it accessible over a GraphQL operation, like a query. You would define the arguments. They can be optional, they can be required, and then you need to define the location. So in this example, you see that I've added it to the schema, so it's a type system directive, and I decided to make it available on field definition. So the field users will be able to use this custom directive. And the question here basically is, where would you define the logic? So if you're using a GraphQL tool or library to build a GraphQL API, they probably have defined it for you somewhere. Maybe it's hidden, maybe it's visible to the end user. But where to define the logic is really the question, because the logic isn't added to the GraphQL schema. The GraphQL schema definition language has no way to sort of include business logic in your schemas. So you would define this basically in your GraphQL implementation, as the GraphQL specification also doesn't define a clear path or strategy on how to do this, because GraphQL, the specification defines that directives are a good way to extend your schema, but it's up to you or the library to define how to actually do this. What you often see is that you would have an executable schema, so this would be a combination of your schema and your set of resolvers and potentially your context. And this executable schema would also include a set of functions that will help you to implement the logic for your directives. So in these functions, the logic would be added to define that, for example, in the previous thing, the at rest would send a request to a REST API, take its response, and match it to whatever's in your GraphQL schema. And how this is actually implemented really depends on the GraphQL tooling that's used. Of course, there are so many GraphQL tools and libraries that the implementations might be similar. So I have an example here from GraphQL tools. And the way they do it is you would define your type definitions. You would say I have a type called person. There are some fields to it. There's type definitions, of course. And two of these fields are using a directive called add-auth. So this is probably to help you do authentication for your GraphQL schema. They would then add something which they call transformers. And these transformers are basically the functions to execute whatever is needed to have your custom directive do what you want it to do. So here they say we have an auth directive, and this takes a transformer which is pulled from some library. It can also be just a local function in case you build your own GraphQL implementation. And then first the executable schema is created, and this executable schema is then extended with all these transformers. So this could be one way to do it, but you can basically try and think of it in a way, if you have an executable schema, it should have a way to work with your custom directives. So what use cases are there? We already saw some use cases. We saw the built-in ones which you can use to include data, or maybe also give a message to people interacting with your GraphQL API, or as in the case what I showed you with the add REST, to have sort of side effects where we pull data from a REST API and return it. There are multiple use cases, of course. So connecting to data sources in a declarative way could be one. So this is really this example where you would call a REST data source or a GraphQL data source or any type of data and match it to the return type. And there's more things you can do here. For example, if you look at GraphQL Federation or any of the other Federation implementations, they're often using custom directives to match types to other types and sort of make the connections between different fields and operations. So it's a good way to extend GraphQL in this way, where you would define where data comes from and then sort of link it up in the same declarative way that the GraphQL schema is. Another way would be to transform data without changing any of the implementation logic. Because you could assume that you build a GraphQL API or use some tooling to build it, you might not be happy with the shape or form the data is returned in. And something people really like around GraphQL is that you have more flexibility in creating the data, in using the data, and have control over the shape and form. So an example could be if you would have a query called getProducts, it would have a field products that returns a list of tags. And as you can see, in the comment I added the unordered list. There's multiple ways to sort this response. And maybe one user of your API wants to sort it in an ascending order, the other one wants to use a descending order. Maybe someone else doesn't want to order it as well, or maybe you want to filter out null values. If you leave this up to the implementation of the GraphQL API, that's one way to go. So it would be basically this example where your query, or actually the field in this query, would take a parameter that says sort, maybe ascending. And there's another way where you would use a custom directive that might be called add_sort to sort this in a more declarative way. So the first approach, it's still declarative in a way that to the user of the GraphQL API, it's declarative. You just add a parameter and things will be sorted for you. But probably inside your implementation, you have a lot of imperative code to take the response, filter it, and then return it in the way the user wants it to be returned. So maybe if your GraphQL API is taking data from a database, you're sorting in the database. If it's taking data from maybe a more static resource like a REST API, you might be having filtering inside your GraphQL API resolver, or maybe you're filtering, maybe you pass the parameter to the REST API. So there's multiple ways to do it, but it's not up to GraphQL to do it. So this wouldn't break the specification because you're just sending a parameter and you sort of implement your own business logic to do it. A downside is this needs to be implemented for every sort of operation field there, because if you have a resolver for products, you probably need to add logic there to filter or sort it in the way that the parameters allow you to do. So another approach would be to create your own custom directive, which would be called add_sort, which could take an argument to make it ascending or descending, or in this example, its default way of sorting it is ascending. So by adding this custom directive, you sort of take away, you lift up the implementation logic from the underlying services or the resolvers more to your GraphQL implementation. So the custom directive would handle the sorting, and you can also immediately apply this to every operation that you have. And then something else you can do is handling repetitive actions like pagination and authentication. Something else I'd like to do if you build your GraphQL API, you're probably in your context, you have a lot of ways to handle repetitive things like authentication or pagination. You try to create functions to, well, not having to repeat yourself every time. You can have the same result with custom directives. So much like the add_sort, which I showed, you can also handle these repetitive actions for different means. And of course, there's nothing wrong if you would still add these to the resolvers or to your context. But I do feel if you create, especially if you create your own GraphQL tooling for the developers to use, it's really useful to add these custom directives. And of course, you can also do this for basically any other repetitive action. And you could even handle side effects. I think why I put the could between the asterisks, I'm not sure if you should do it, but of course you could do it. I guess there's always nice discussions around building GraphQL APIs, schema first or code first, or how much logic you want to handle inside the GraphQL SDL. So custom directives are a good way to extend the GraphQL spec, adding new things to it. But I also think you shouldn't take it too far. There's sort of a, well, you can go extend it, but you should make sure you don't abuse it in a way that it's no longer GraphQL, but you're taking it a bit too far. That's why I like to say you can use these directives to bend the rules, but you shouldn't bend them too far, otherwise you might get into dangerous territory. So this is all great, custom directives. I really like them, adding them to, especially if you build your own GraphQL tooling, either server-side or client-side tooling. But there's one thing, now the GraphQL ecosystem is growing, and if you look at all the talks that have been presented already, there's so many ways to build GraphQL APIs, to handle GraphQL from a front-end perspective. And the ecosystem is really growing, and it's becoming quite large, actually. And so is the number of custom directives. If you're using any kind of tooling, you probably came across custom directives, and at some point, you might not even know if the directive is a sort of GraphQL specification directive or it's just being used by popular tooling that's around. If we look at the specification, they actually give a small note in the custom directive section saying that when you define a custom directive, it might be good to add a prefix, thereby stating to users of your API or tooling that they will actually know that it's coming from a certain implementation and it's not a built-in directive. I must say we're not using it ourselves in StepZen, where we use a lot of custom directives, but it might be a good approach to start doing this, especially if you build your own GraphQL implementation and you have lots of custom directives. It might be nice to actually add these underscores and these prefixes, because the naming has to be unique. So if you're building on top of existing tooling and you add your own custom directives on top of it, at some point you might get into breaking scenarios where you might be importing a custom directive that might be breaking one of your own custom directives. So these are things you might want to prevent. So I guess if any of you is looking for a new open source project or needs to have a free open source project idea, what I would find really cool to see is some directory of all the custom directives that are available. So when you create your own tooling, you can actually go to this directory and figure out what directives are being used anywhere. And maybe if there's a huge overlap in all these directives, there could be some nice approach to somehow specify this and take it to any of the working groups and see if there would be a future for having a custom directives that becomes a built-in one, and then it's up to the implementation to make sure that this is handled in a way that's useful. So to recap, custom directives are great for extending GraphQL APIs, and if you look at the specification, they're also the preferred way to extend GraphQL beyond what's described in the specification. And you can either define them in the type system, so this is in your GraphQL schema, and within the type system there are multiple locations as well, or you can put them in an executable location so you can use them whenever you send your documents to the GraphQL API. And I think one big thing I learned from working with custom directives is that there's no clear overview of what custom directives are around. So it might be nice for anyone from the community to start working on it. I'd love to do it myself, but well, there's always other things to do. So thank you for your time. I hope you enjoyed it. If you have any follow-up questions, I believe we have time, but feel free to catch me at the conference or on Twitter. And tomorrow I'll be doing another talk actually around GraphQL and AI. So I hope to see you there. Thank you. Any questions? Yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great question. So the question was sort of the execution order, right? What's the Yeah, if we have conflicting custom directives, I think, as you said, a specification doesn't really tell you how to do it. It just tells you you should put it either in a type system or an executable location, and then where to apply it, like a field or an input field definition. And it should be unique. I think I summed it up somewhere. So I'm not really sure what would be the best approach here. I guess it's really up to the sort of tooling you use to build the directive. So if you build your own custom directives, there should probably be some sorting in there. Yeah, it's a good question. I wouldn't know the exact answer, actually. But I guess it's really up to the implementation to either make sure that you don't duplicate it, maybe by setting the location slightly different. Maybe you want to put the location at the field definition, but not so much at types, but mostly operations only. That could be a solution. Or put it in your transformers somehow to make sure it's aware of other potential custom directives you've defined. Yeah, I think there's a lot to learn there still on best sort of methods of best practices of implementing this. Okay, cool. Then thank you. Oh, sorry, one other question. So your question is, if you're using federation and in downstream services or downstream GraphQL APIs, you're using custom directives, how they sort of would move up the chain? Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, I think it will be kind of hard to share directives in a multi-language environment. If you're building everything in JavaScript or Python, then it would be easy to create a package or library and then share them across these things. If you're using multiple languages, I think it will be harder. They would then either decide to use custom directives only in downstream services or only use them in the gateway, if these are some things that would apply to all the downstream services. I don't think there is a way to share them as of just yet, because they really depend on the implementation logic that you would have in your GraphQL tooling to create the server. But it's a great question. Thank you. Okay, thanks everyone.